Well, we've talked about what was in Magna Carta. We've seen that it's quite a long document. We've seen as well that to modernise, it's quite a ragbag sort of document. Can we say anything about how it was drawn up, how it was drafted, how it was written? Unfortunately, these are rather difficult questions to answer because no eyewitness account of the events at Runnymede in the first 2 weeks of June 1215 has come down to us. No one who was a participant in the events there has written a day-by-day diary sort of account of what happened. Our main narrative sources were written by the chroniclers, and the chroniclers were writing in their monasteries at St Albans or Bury St Edmunds, for example, some years afterwards, and they were relying on hearsay. They had not been there themselves. Now, we can infer a certain amount. We know that there was shuttle diplomacy going on between the two sides. Remember, we saw at Runnymede that the barons were based at Staines, the king was based at Windsor. Envoys were going backwards and forwards between the two sides. Baronial delegations were going to Windsor. It was all a bit like modern-day shuttle diplomacy of the sort that US Secretaries of State are so expert at these days. And the man who in June 1215 played the part of the American Secretary of State was Stephen Langton, the Archbishop of Canterbury, a very clever and highly significant and influential figure. But can we go any further? Can we go beyond that? Well, yes, with the aid of this copy of Magna Carta in particular, we can. Because what is important about this copy of Magna Carta that was preserved at Peterborough is that the copy of Magna Carta transcribed within it appears to be copied from a discarded draft created in the course of the negotiations. We can picture what was going on in early June 1215. Draft after draft of the terms was drawn up. Barons would draw up a draft, Langton would take it to the king would say, oh no, I'm not having that, I want that clause amended, I want that clause taken out. They'd go back, they'd come up with a fresh draft, the previous one would be thrown away. Then they'd argue about the second draft, and there would be disagreements between the two sides about that. That second draft would be cast away. And this went on until finally a compromise was thrashed out on which the two sides could agree. And what appears to have happened is that those discarded early drafts were sometimes picked up by people involved in the negotiations, taken back home, and then transcribed into a book of statutes, a book of laws like this. And that's what appears to have happened here. There are quite a number of drafts copied into manuscripts a few years later, perhaps by people thinking in all good faith that they were the original agreed version, but which are in fact discarded drafts. And when you look at these discarded drafts, you can see significant, minor but significant variations in the wording, which allows us to eavesdrop on the negotiations between the barons and the king. And just to take an example of how it works, I'm looking now at a clause which in the final agreed version of the Charter became clause 55, and it relates to the making of fines with the king. Now, I should explain that the word fine in the 13th century had a different meaning from the word fine today. A fine today is a financial penalty if you do something wrong. If you go outside into Piccadilly and you park your car on a double yellow line, you get a parking ticket and you pay a fine. Now, a fine in the Middle Ages did not mean that. A fine in the Middle Ages meant a sum of money which you paid to the king to secure a favour, a concession from him. And that is the sense in which fine is employed in Magna Carta. In the final version of the Charter, it says very simply, all fines which have been made with us unjustly will be remitted, that is to say, cancelled. Now, in this version, which preserves a discarded draft, the wording is different. It's more specific. It says, all fines relating to dowries and marriages which have been made by us unjustly will be remitted. You see, it's more specific. It says fines relating to dowries, that's the lands assigned to a widow, and marriages will be remitted. That was the Baron's opening gambit. And in the final version, it was watered down. It became a fudge to mean something much less specific. The king had won a significant concession. So, we learn two main things from looking at the version of the Charter preserved in this copy. We learn first of all that the making of Magna Carta was just like any political negotiating process today. It involved give and take. It involved one side making a concession, then another side making a concession, until finally compromise terms were agreed. But what we also see, absolutely fascinating this, is that right at the last moment, the barons were making concessions to the king. We might suppose that it would be the other way round, that the king, at the losing end of a war, would be making concessions to the barons. And yes, the king was making concessions, that happened. But equally, the barons wanted a deal as well. They wanted a quick deal. They wanted the struggle over. They were prepared to make concessions too. And that is the big lesson we learn from this clause in Magna Carta.